Thank you very much. Yes, I have to say from the beginning that in my title there's a little white lie because there is no actual theory of postmodernism in Stanley Cavell's thought. But I think that there are some places in this work that would be somehow interesting to analyze. So, yes, okay. So, I mean, I could have focused, for example, on Cavell's writing on Derrida, or on his theory of skepticism, or also... Okay. Also on his ontology of film, where he goes a great deal about his neo-Bazinian, neo-realist ontology of film. But I chose to do something a little bit different. So I will begin by focusing on Cavell's writing from the 60s and early 70s, where he puts forth a well-structured, albeit ambivalent, theory of modernism in the arts and in philosophy, at the center of which are notions of formal experimentation and self-reflexiveness that are not utterly alien to postmodernist practices. I will also develop on some of his dismissive remarks on pop art, which allow us to extrapolate a position concerning what in a postmodernist context we would call irony, playfulness, and fragmentation. Then, in the second half of my paper, I will argue that virtually everything Cavell says on modernism and related topics, both in praise and in criticism, should be understood against the backdrop of his more general normative idea of philosophy, literature, and the arts as means for a shared humanistic conversation, cultural conversation, an idea that in his later writing he has expressed through the concept of perfectionism and Emersonian perfectionism. So in the end there are some similarities between his perspective and what Roberto Baldacci was talking about before it, I think. So I would like to begin by arguing that in Stanley Cavell's perspective, modernism is a condition, I would say. A situation in which a practitioner of an art, or more generally of a discipline, finds himself. So although we find no attempt by Cavell to situate modernism within a wider social, cultural, or economic context, there is a sense of inadaptability. Past a certain threshold, it is impossible not to become modernists if one wants to keep doing what Cavell calls, with a problematic expression, serious art. Such threshold will be characterized by a different timing and a different inner dynamic, depending on whether it is painting, sculpture, theater, or film that we're dealing with. But a sense of determinism is there. This is part of how I take his talking of modernism as a burden. If we read Cavell's 1969 collection, Must We Mean What We Say, together with his 1971 The World Viewed, we can, in my opinion, identify at least 4 traits of such modernist predicament. It entails a sense of inevitable exhaustion of traditional conventions, a refocusing of the practice on the defining traits of the medium itself, 3, a tendency to problematize or even, as he says, defeat the audience, and 4, but I will not have time to dwell upon this 4th element, a constant and anxious attempt to avoid what Cavell calls the threat of fraudulence. In an interesting 2010 article published on the Journal of Music Theory, Franklin Cox remarked that a modernist situation entails for Cavell an existential crisis, affecting at the same time artists, critics, and audiences. In Cavell's opinion, what happens to music composers like John Cage and Ernst Krenek, to a playwright like Samuel Beckett, a sculptor like Anthony Caro, or a film director like Jean-Luc Godard, is that at some point, for some reason, they feel they have to problematize their whole relationship to both their audiences and the past tradition of their practice. So the conventions of the tradition are not enough to say what they have to say. Sticking to them would not only determine a lack of originality, but more radically would push their production outside the realm of serious art altogether. At the same time, Cavell identifies a very specific process for this modernist reinvention of conventions. It is true every avant-garde movement, possibly every individual artist, will have to radically reinvent the procedures of the medium they are working with. And here we see a clear influence of the writing on modernism published by Clement Greenberg on the Partisan Review. The aim of such reinvention is not cutting all ties with the medium and its tradition, but as Cavell puts it, to rediscover the medium. By focusing on the medium-specific traits of the art form, on the flat delimited surface of the canvas for painting, on the mere existence of time and sound in music, the modernist artist will discover, as for the first time, what the medium had been from the beginning. Modernist works, that is, are self-reflexive, works whose research has a strongly ontological penchant. Interesting in this respect are Cavell's remarks concerning the difference between modernists and what he calls, in a derogatory sense, the modernizers. Modernizers are the representatives of pop art, which Cavell discusses in a 1977 essay called A Matter of Meaning It. Pop art, unlike modernist art, shows no commitment to painting as an art. Does not, and I'm about to quote quite extensively Cavell's words, does not struggle with the history which makes it an art, continuing and countering the conventions and intentions and responses which comprise that history. It may be, Cavell goes on, that the history of a given art has come to an end. But it is as if the various anti-art movements claim to know this has happened and to provide us with distraction, while at the same time they claim the respect due only to those whose seriousness they cannot share, and they receive it because of our frightened confusion. End of quote. These are harsh words with a clearly conservative undertone. Cavell faults pop art because of its lack of interest, not in tradition, but in its continuation. It faults it for its supposed lack of interest in seriousness, for its lack of interest in the distinction between the high and the low. Now, Cavell refuses pop modernizers, but what is probably even more interesting is that in several occasions, his humanist conservatism seemed to arrive to the point of refusing modernism as well. This is the impression one easily gets when reading his essays on modern music and his book on film. In Music Discomposed, for example, Cavell analyzes two journals specialized in the theory and analysis of modern music, the German language Die Reiche, originally edited by Stockhausen, and the American journal Perspectives of New Music. He found them obsessed, and these are again his words, with newness itself, prey of an intimidating technicality and arcane apparatuses, characterized by a total absence of humane music criticism, end of quote. That is, by a criticism able to open the music art form to the understanding of an audience other than those of music composers, of modern music composers themselves. Such journals reflect the situation of an art whose practices, I quote, ensure that their work will not be comprehensible to any audience, end of quote. An analogous anti-modernist feeling seeps through the pages of The World Viewed, which was published during the roaring years of the American New Wave, but is entirely permeated by a nostalgia for the classical Hollywood, for that one and only art, as he says, that had resisted the fate of modernism. A consideration of other parts of Cavell's writing on modernism in the arts would actually dispel this impression that he was simply an opponent of it. I could mention, for example, a defense of Samuel Beckett from the accusation made by Georgi Lukács, or Cavell's whole idea that the reason why film resisted the fate of modernism is that due to its peculiar ontology, film is inherently self-reflexive. That is, that in some sense, film was born modernist. But enough with modernism in the art. It is at this point that I'd like, so to speak, to change horses and discuss Cavell's notion of the relationship between modernism and philosophy itself. The foreword of Must We Mean What We Say is quite interestingly entitled An Audience for Philosophy. Cavell here is straightforward. Philosophy too, he argues, is undergoing a modernist crisis. Philosophy too, like theater, painting and music, is not sure anymore of what it should say and how it should say it. It is not sure of its aims, of its methods, of whether it has a mission which concerns society as a whole, or whether it has no mission at all, whether it should become a science or stay one of the humanities, whether it can take for granted its tradition or must cut all ties with it, whether it must be continental or analytic. What is most important is that philosophy does not know whether it has an audience or not. Science, Cavell argues, is indifferent to the existence of an audience, or more precisely, science has in principle no audience at all. Of art, on the other hand, is in some sense analytically true that it has an audience, and this is why the burden of modernism can be so heavy for it. But what about philosophy then? What about a philosophy that is increasingly being written and communicated in the literary form of the academic article? Can such a philosophy, asks Cavell, has an audience apart from that of other academics? And what happens to a philosophy that discovers it has no audience anymore? Can philosophy give up what, since Plato's Republic, has been its continuing aim? Shaping the polis, educating its ideal citizen? In his 1987 This New Yet Unapproachable America, Cavell rejects the solution offered by his friend Richard Rorty. To Cavell's worries about the present irrelevance of philosophy in the public sphere, Rorty used to answer that the solution is for philosophy to stop worrying about its tradition, about its epistemic status, about truth itself, and rather become some sort of ironic, post-philosophical cultural conversation. In Cavell's eyes, however, Rorty's suggestion was bound to appear as untenable as the work of the pop-modernizers discussed before. In lieu of an anti-art stance, we find an anti-philosophy stance, in which, and I paraphrase the previous quote by Cavell, it is as if the various anti-philosophy movements claim to know the end of philosophy has happened and provide us with distraction, while at the same time they claim their respect due only to those whose seriousness they cannot share. On the contrary, Cavell's This New Yet Unapproachable America is permeated by the problem of preserving a continuity for philosophy. By the time of 1987, Cavell has come to call it the problem of philosophy's inheritance of itself. All the major figures taken into account in these lectures are trying to figure out how and to what extent they can inherit philosophy. For American transcendentalists such as Emerson and Thoreau, this would mean inheriting Europe. For Heidegger, inheriting the problem of being in a time of Europe's demise. For the Wittgenstein of the philosophical investigation, inheriting our own words, leading them home as from a metaphysical exile. In this insistence of continuity, is this insistence on continuity somewhat conservative? In Cavell's opinion, it is not, and the reason is that for him, philosophy, like film, was born modernist. The aim of what John Dewey called a reconstruction in philosophy is shared by virtually all major thinkers of the last few centuries. Going backwards is at the core of Wittgenstein's idea of philosophy as therapy, of Nietzsche's abuse, philosophizing with a hammer, of Hegel's dialectic, of Kant's notion of critique. This attitude, in the end, can be traced back to Plato's Republic, and to its founding myth, or allegory of philosophy. The cave, where prisoners are kept in darkness and ignorance, from which one manages to escape, freeing himself or herself from the bondage of traditional education, only to go back when ready to help the others and collaborate with them in the construction of a new tradition, a new education, a new political community. That philosophy was born modernist means that philosophy was born self-critical and self-reflexive, that the first question of philosophy has always been the meta-philosophical question: what is philosophy? Its second question being that concerning the relationship between philosophy and its time. This is where I think everything Cavell has written on modernism, both in the arts and in philosophy, both in skepticism and enthusiasm, comes together. When the arts reach the condition of modernism, which means when the arts start existing in the condition of philosophy, they are faced with one of philosophy's most ancient dilemmas. It is again Plato who described it in his founding myth. When the free man goes back to the cave, his eyes are not used to darkness anymore. He stammers. His old fellow inmates seem unable to understand what he has to say. And here comes a temptation, giving up the other, turning away from our social conversation. Cavell calls it, when he talks about the modernist music of John Cage and Ernst Krenek, the risk of defeating commonality. Wittgenstein would have called it harboring the fantasy of a private language. Instead of this defeatist attitude, what the best philosophy does, as well as the best modernist and probably also postmodernist art, is trying to reconcile self-reflexiveness with commonality. Reconcile the need to put each and every one of our words and practices under scrutiny, to reinvent them for our own present purposes, with the other equally important need to make them part of a renewed social conversation. Every speech act, whether in philosophy, in the arts, or in our ordinary language, is in Cavell's Wittgensteinian perspective at the same time an act of creation, a claim to community, to a world we share in common. Philosophy and art are equally called to this act of responsibility in carrying the ancient burden of modernism. There is a page in his 1990 book, Conditions Handsome and Unhandsome, where Cavell builds something like a Western canon in the vein of Harold Bloom. But his list includes indifferently philosophers, novelists, poets, religious thinkers, directors. It goes from Plato to Frank Capra. Genre differences seem to be completely effaced. What it is that Cavell is building a canon of. He's building a canon of text for what he calls perfectionism. In Cavell's work, unlike other Anglo-American philosophers, perfectionism is not a technical term within the academic debate of moral philosophy, but another word for philosophy itself. Philosophy, literature, and the arts concur in a shared cultural conversation that takes the perfectionist form of education, in which what is at stake is the imagination of a new self for the individual as connected with a project of a new constitution for the political community. For Cavell, it is within the boundaries of such project that modernism, including its antagonistic stance toward audiences, should be channeled and encouraged. And we might surmise that it will be within these same boundaries that Cavell would accept and maybe even encourage such postmodernist playfulness that aims at reflexive self-awareness rather than to a Protagorean epistemic relativism. Whether Cavell's neo-humanistic outlook should be deemed human, whole to human, is beyond the scope of my paper, but I mean, Cavell is so convinced that of his low-key attitude, he arrives to the point of calling philosophy an education for the grown-ups. So I conclude with the hope that this paper hasn't been too much of a detour, and that at some point at least of his postmodern condition has been somehow addressed. So I thank you.